20 for caves, an entire country for God. Imagine a country with one of the world's oldest continuous written traditions. Thousands of years of chronicles, annals, imperial decrees, and local archives that recorded almost every significant construction project on its territory. Now imagine that at the very heart of this country there exists a massive man-made underground complex. 20 for enormous caverns, carved out of solid rock with engineering precision comparable to modern calculations, and not a single word about it appears anywhere in those thousand-year-old archives. This isn't a hypothesis, this is the reality of the Longyou Caves in China's Zhejiang province. And the fact that an entire century's deep written tradition stays completely silent about them may be the most unsettling detail in the whole story. Upon someone decided to drain before 1992, local residents of a village near the town of Longyou knew this place simply as a cluster of deep ponds. According to legends passed down through generations, the ponds were considered bottomless and no one ever swam in them or tried to measure their depth. They were said to be home to dragons, or perhaps evil spirits. One thing was reliably known: the fish local farmers had raised in these ponds for years grew to enormous sizes, which only reinforced the sense that something was unusual about the water here. In 1992, a handful of local residents finally decided to find out what lay at the bottom and organized a pumping operation to drain the water. The process took 17 days of continuous work. When the water finally receded, what was exposed wasn't the muddy bottom of a natural pond, but a massive man-made underground chamber with smooth, nearly vertical stone walls, covered in evenly spaced parallel tool marks, descending to a depth of roughly 30 meters. Further investigation revealed this wasn't an isolated find. Across an area of only about 1 square kilometer, archaeologists identified a total of 20 for such underground chambers, several of which remain filled with water and haven't been fully explored to this day. Engineering that shouldn't be anonymous. The scale of the Longyou Caves is striking on its own. The largest chambers reach 12 meters in height, and each covers an area measured in thousands of square meters. The ceilings are supported by massive stone pillars that weren't quarried elsewhere and installed separately. They were carved directly out of the surrounding rock, deliberately left in place to serve as structural supports. In other words, the builders carved the empty space around each pillar, planning the entire structure in advance as a single unified design rather than assembling it from prefabricated parts. Across the walls, ceilings, and columns of the caves run rows of parallel tool marks, applied with an almost obsessive regularity. The angle and spacing between the lines remain nearly identical throughout the entire complex, as if every surface had been carved to a single, unified construction standard rather than worked haphazardly, site by site, by disconnected crews. Engineers who have studied the caves in modern times have noted that the load calculations, the placement of support columns, and the overall structural stability, apparently intact after well over 1,000 years, point to a carefully calculated architectural project rather than chaotic, improvised quarrying. By the most conservative estimates, the total volume of rock removed to create the entire complex comes to roughly 1 million cubic meters. That's an enormous undertaking, comparable in scale to building a mid-sized pyramid, except directed downward, into the earth, rather than upward. And yet not a single fragment of pottery, not a single inscription, not one tool left behind by the builders provides a clear answer to who actually built it. The silence of the chronicles. This is where the story gets genuinely strange. China, unlike many other ancient civilizations, has an unusually detailed written tradition stretching back, almost without interruption, more than 3,000 years. Local, provincial, and county chronicles, compiled by officials under strict bureaucratic standards, recorded the construction of temples, irrigation canals, city walls, roads, down to fairly modest local building projects. And yet for a complex that, by engineers' estimates, must have taken years of labor by tens of thousands of people, these archives offer nothing but silence. Not a single mention in the local chronicles of the county where the caves are located. Not one document, not a hint in any imperial decree, not even a legend directly tying the caves to a specific historical event or ruler. There are a few possible explanations for this gap in historical memory, and none of them is universally accepted. The first, construction may have taken place during a relatively turbulent, poorly documented period of Chinese history, when local archives simply failed to survive to the present day. China, despite its written tradition, has repeatedly endured wars and periods of upheaval during which enormous volumes of documents were lost forever. The second, more intriguing possibility, the project may have originally been intended as a secret undertaking of state or military significance, with access to information about it deliberately restricted, and the caves may have been deliberately flooded after completion specifically to hide their existence and purpose from outsiders. Tomb, quarry, or something else entirely. As for the cave's actual purpose, researchers have proposed several competing theories, and none has been conclusively confirmed. The first, most down-to-earth explanation, an ordinary quarry, mined for building stone to serve the region's needs over an extended period. The problem with this theory is that it doesn't explain the deliberate architectural regularity of the chambers. Ordinary quarries, extracting material purely for the stone itself, rarely display this kind of uniform, aesthetically deliberate layout, with evenly spaced columns, symmetrical room proportions, and identical decorative tool mark angles across every wall surface, as though the builders cared not only about extracting material but about the appearance of the empty space that would remain once the rock was removed. The second theory, a hidden imperial necropolis or secret storage facility, deliberately concealed and designed to be flooded afterward as protection against tomb robbers, a practice broadly consistent with Chinese tradition, where imperial burials were often equipped with elaborate traps and camouflage. The third theory, supported by some contemporary Chinese researchers, a military or strategic complex, possibly used to store provisions, weapons, or shelter troops during one of the many dynastic wars. The cave's location near ancient trade and military routes in southern China theoretically fits this hypothesis. None of these theories fully explains why a construction project of this scale left behind absolutely no written trace at all, and until direct archaeological confirmation of one of these hypotheses emerges, such as a datable inscription or a clearly identifiable artifact from the era of construction, the Longyou Caves formally remain one of the few genuinely anonymous monumental construction projects in human history. The age dispute dating the complex is another area of deep uncertainty. Shortly after its discovery, many researchers initially proposed a relatively modest age, on the order of a few hundred years, pointing to stone-working techniques resembling certain later Chinese mining operations. But as the regularity of the architectural plan and the erosion characteristics of the stone surfaces were studied more closely, some geologists and archaeologists began leaning toward far older estimates, potentially 2,000 years or more, which would push construction back to the Han Dynasty or even earlier periods. Without reliable organic material for radiocarbon analysis inside the caves themselves, such as remnants of wooden scaffolding or torches, precise dating remains extremely difficult. Stone surfaces on their own, unlike organic material, aren't directly datable through radiocarbon methods, and indirect geological techniques produce a wider range of estimates to settle the debate once and for all. A horse, a fish, and a bird. Carved for no apparent reason, there is another detail that rarely makes it into short retellings of the Longyou story, but it leaves researchers just as puzzled as the architecture of the chambers themselves. On the walls of several caves, alongside the repeating parallel tool marks, archaeologists found individual large-scale relief carvings of animals, a horse, a bird, and a fish, carved with noticeably more artistic detail than the purely functional marks left by quarrying. The trouble is, these images don't form any coherent narrative and aren't accompanied by any explanatory symbols or inscriptions whatsoever. They lay scattered across different caves, apparently executed using different techniques and possibly even at different times, which hints that the complex may have been used, or at least added to, over an extended period, rather than carved all at once according to a single plan from start to finish. Some researchers see these reliefs as decorative elements typical of a temple or ritual space. Animals in Chinese tradition often carry symbolic weight tied to luck, fertility, or protection. Others suspect the images might have functioned as a kind of signature or mark left by individual crews of workers laboring in different chambers of the complex, a sort of ancient equivalent of a contractor's stamp. Neither theory has found convincing confirmation so far, and the carvings themselves only deepen the impression that has haunted researchers of Longyou from the very beginning. What we're looking at clearly isn't just utilitarian stone extraction, but a space the builders invested with meaning that went beyond simply mining material, though exactly what that meaning was remains impossible to pin down. A scale that is hard to explain with a small workforce. It is worth pausing on what 1,000,000 cubic meters of removed rock actually means in practical terms. Experimental estimates, based on the rate of hand-carving stone of comparable hardness in other archaeological projects, suggest that building the entire complex could have required the labor of several tens of thousands of people over several years of continuous work, assuming purely manual quarrying methods without gunpowder or modern machinery. That number alone is staggering for a project official history knows nothing about. Mobilizing tens of thousands of workers in a pre-industrial society typically requires organization at the level of the state, food supply chains, tool logistics, medical support, basic discipline maintained over years of construction. Projects of comparable scale in Chinese history, sections of the Great Wall, imperial canals, royal tombs, have, with virtually no exceptions, left behind an extensive documentary trail. Decrees mobilizing labor, complaints from local officials about a shortage of hands for the fields, progress reports on construction. The absence of any such trail for Longyou looks statistically almost implausible for a project of this magnitude. And that is precisely why the theory of deliberate secrecy, for all its speculative nature, continues to strike some researchers as the most logical explanation for this anomalous silence. Why they aren't linked to the legendary dragon-esque capital. One interesting detail. Some researchers connect the Longyou Caves to a semi-legendary local place name, roughly translating to something like Dragon Hill or Wandering Dragon, which appears in a handful of much later, less reliable regional sources prone to blending history with local folklore. Treating this as direct proof of a link between the caves and a specific historical episode would be premature. Such place names are extremely common across China and don't prove anything on their own. But the fact that the local name has hinted for centuries at something hidden, draconic, and underground adds an extra layer of irony to the story. Perhaps folk memory did, in fact, preserve a faint, distorted echo of the truth, just in the form of legend rather than documentation. What is happening at the caves today? Part of the Longyou Caves complex is open to visitors as both a tourist site and an active research location, connected by a system of underground walkways and platforms built over the remaining water. Chinese engineering and archaeological institutions continue periodic studies of the complex, including ground-penetrating radar surveys of the surrounding area in search of additional, still undiscovered chambers. But fundamentally, the central question, who built this underground city carved into solid rock, when, and above all, why, remains unanswered more than 30 years after the first pond was drained. Every expedition that descends into another still unexplored chamber could, in theory, uncover the fragment capable of finally breaking the deadlock, a tool fragment made of a datable metal alloy, or a half-erased inscription tucked into some hidden niche that earlier researchers simply missed in the dim light of their lanterns. And perhaps it is precisely this silence, rather than the sheer scale of carved stone, that makes Longyou such an unsettling find. In a culture that spent centuries recording nearly every decree and every significant structure, It turned out to be possible to completely and irrecoverably erase the labor of tens of thousands of people from memory. And along with it, the reason they toiled underground in the first place.